You've seen luxury homes, flashy cars, and celebrity lifestyles, but what if the real flex isn't in the city at all? Hidden away from the spotlight, Katrina Halili is building something far more powerful, a massive farm that's turning heads for all the right reasons. This isn't just land, it's a full-blown empire in the making. From scale to strategy, everything feels next level. Stick around, because what's really happening behind the scenes might completely change how you see wealth. On number 1, the unexpected shift. For most people in the Philippines, Katrina Halili is a name tied to entertainment, television, and a long-standing presence in the public eye. She built her identity in front of cameras, through roles, appearances, and the kind of visibility that comes with being part of an industry where recognition is everything. For years, her world was defined by schedules, sets, and the fast rhythm of show business. A space where staying relevant often depends on how consistently you remain seen. But at a certain point, something in that rhythm begins to shift. Not loudly, not in a way that immediately signals change, but gradually through small differences that only start to make sense when you look at the bigger picture. Because public figures don't always announce transitions. Sometimes they simply start moving differently. A quieter presence here, a less visible routine there, and a growing distance from the constant pace of public-facing work. And before long, people begin to notice something feels different, even if they can't immediately define what it is. That's where the curiosity begins in this story. Because shifts like this are never just about lifestyle on the surface. They usually reflect something deeper happening underneath. Something about direction, priorities, or how someone begins to redefine what success means to them. And in Katrina Halili's case, that's exactly what starts to form. A redirection, away from constant visibility and towards something far more grounded. Because instead of staying fully locked into a world built around attention and exposure, there's a gradual movement towards something that operates completely differently. Something quieter, something slower, something that doesn't rely on being seen to have value. And that's where land enters the picture. Not as a sudden dramatic reveal, but as a natural contrast to everything she has known publicly. Because land does not function like entertainment, it doesn't depend on audience reaction. It doesn't rise and fall based on trends or attention cycles. It exists independently of visibility. And when it is developed or used properly, it produces value over time, steadily, consistently, without needing constant recognition. That alone makes it fundamentally different from the world she is associated with. In entertainment, especially in industries like the one she came from in the Philippines, everything moves quickly. Attention defines relevance, public presence defines opportunity, and careers often depend on staying in motion, always visible, always present, always active. But land doesn't move like that. It works on time. And time does not rush. That contrast is what makes this shift feel interesting in this narrative version of events. Because it suggests something deeper than just a change of scenery. It suggests a change in how value itself is understood. Instead of value being tied to visibility, it begins to lean towards something more physical, more structured, more long-term. Something that continues even when no one is watching. And that is where the idea of stability begins to replace the idea of attention. Because stability doesn't require an audience. It requires consistency. It requires structure. It requires systems that continue working even in silence. And land naturally fits into that framework. It doesn't rely on constant validation. It doesn't depend on external approval. It simply follows cycles, planting, growth, harvest, and renewal, repeating over time in a rhythm that is slow but dependable. And in that sense, it represents a completely different kind of success model. One that is not built around how often you are seen, but around what continues to exist and function when you are not. So when this narrative frames a shift connected to Katrina Halili, it is not about a sudden transformation. It is about a subtle redirection in mindset, a movement away from a system driven by attention toward one driven by continuity. And that is what makes it compelling, because it reflects something larger happening beyond one person. A growing awareness that not all success needs to be loud. Some of it is built quietly, some of it grows slowly, and some of it only becomes visible when you step far enough back to see the structure underneath it all. And that's where the real story begins to unfold, because once you understand the shift, the next question naturally becomes, what does that new world actually look like when you step inside it? And that is where everything moves next. 2. Inside the massive farm. Stepping into this version of the world connected to Katrina Halili in the Philippines feels like entering an entirely different rhythm of life. The first thing that hits you is the silence. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of space. Wide, open land stretches further than expected, broken only by structured divisions that separate one function from another. Nothing feels random. Every direction has purpose. Every section of ground seems assigned to a role. This is not a decorative estate. It is a working system. The land itself is divided into clear agricultural zones. One section is actively prepared for planting, with soil freshly turned and leveled. Another section shows early-stage growth, where crops begin to form in neat, controlled rows. Further away, there are resting zones, patches of land left untouched to recover naturally before being used again in the next cycle. That rotation is constant, and it defines everything. Because in farming environments like this, land is never treated as a one-time resource. It is treated as something that moves through phases: use, rest, recovery, and reuse. Without that structure, productivity drops. With it, the system stays alive over time. As you move deeper inside, irrigation becomes visible as one of the most important hidden systems. Water channels or pump-fed distribution lines guide flow across different sections of the land. Instead of relying purely on weather, water is directed intentionally, ensuring each crop zone receives what it needs at the right stage of growth. It is controlled, measured, deliberate, and without it, nothing else would function properly. Then come the support structures. Small storage units are placed across different points of the property. These are simple but essential spaces, used for storing seeds, farming tools, fertilizers, and harvested produce before transport or processing. They are not designed for appearance. They exist purely for function, quietly supporting the entire operation behind the scenes. Nearby, you can find working areas where materials are organized and prepared. Some sections are used for sorting harvested crops, others for temporary storage, and others for preparing the next planting cycle. Everything is arranged for efficiency rather than aesthetics. And then there is the equipment. Basic farming tools are present throughout Katrina Halili's farmland, used for soil preparation, planting, maintenance, and harvesting. In some areas, small mechanized equipment helps reduce manual workload, especially during land preparation or transport. In other sections, manual tools still dominate, reflecting a balance between tradition and efficiency. Nothing here is excessive. Everything is functional. What stands out most is not any single structure, but how everything connects. The farm operates like a loop. Soil preparation leads into planting. Planting leads to growth. Growth leads into harvesting. Harvesting feeds back into preparation for the next cycle. Each stage depends on the one before it and directly shapes the one after it. There is no separation between phases, only continuity. Even when the land appears still, it is not inactive. Beneath that stillness, processes are always in motion. Soil is restoring itself. Water is circulating through channels. Planning for the next cycle is already underway. The system never truly stops. It only changes stage. And that creates a completely different feeling of time. Inside this space, time doesn't rush. It moves in cycles. In contrast to the fast-paced world Katrina Halili is associated with, where schedules, visibility, and attention often define daily life, this environment follows a slower, more grounded rhythm. Here, nothing is measured by speed. Everything is measured by completion of cycles. And those cycles cannot be forced. They cannot be rushed. They can only be maintained. That is what gives the space its identity, not luxury, not spectacle, but structure. A structure built around repetition, patience, and consistency. And when you stand in the middle of it, the most striking realization is how organized everything feels. Even in its simplicity. There is no chaos, no randomness. Every part of the land serves a purpose, and every purpose feeds into a larger system. It is not just farmland. It is a functioning ecosystem designed to sustain itself over time. And as you move through it, one thought naturally begins to form. This is not about what the land looks like, it is about what it does. And that is where the story moves next. Month 3. The business behind it. Once you move past the visual impression of the farm, the real story begins to reveal itself in how everything operates day to day. Because Katrina Halili, agricultural setup in the Philippines is not just about land being used, it's about a system running in cycles, almost like a quiet machine that never fully stops. And what makes it interesting is how structured it is underneath the calm surface. At the center of everything is the farming cycle itself. It always begins the same way: preparation. Before anything grows, the land has to be ready. Soil is tilled, cleared, and conditioned depending on what will be planted next. This stage is not visible in a dramatic sense, but it is the foundation of everything that follows. Without preparation, nothing else in the system works. Then comes planting. Seeds or young crops are placed in structured rows, not randomly, but in patterns that maximize space, water access, and future yield. This is where planning becomes visible because farming is never just about putting things into soil. It's about spacing, timing, and coordination. After planting, the system shifts into maintenance. This is where irrigation becomes critical. Water is not left to chance. It is directed through controlled channels or pump-based systems that ensure each section of land receives what it needs. Too much water can damage crops. Too little can slow growth. So everything is measured, even if it's done quietly in the background. And alongside water management comes constant monitoring. Even in this version of the farm, you can imagine workers or caretakers moving through different sections, checking growth patterns, adjusting soil conditions, or responding to small changes in weather or crop behavior. Nothing is left completely unattended. Because farming doesn't operate on autopilot, it operates on attention to detail. Then comes the waiting phase, often the longest part of the cycle. This is where growth happens slowly, without visible change day by day. Crops develop beneath sunlight, soil, and water, following natural timing that cannot be rushed. And this is where the discipline of the system becomes most obvious. Because nothing can force this stage to move faster. It has to happen in its own time. And that patience is what defines agriculture in places like the Philippines, where seasonal patterns, weather shifts, and land conditions all influence how production unfolds. Eventually, the cycle reaches harvesting. This is the most visible stage, but not the most important. Crops are collected, sorted, and prepared for storage or distribution. Some may go directly to market channels, while others are kept for future planting cycles or internal use. But even harvesting is not an ending. It is just a transition, because immediately after harvest, the system loops back into preparation again. The land is cleared, restored, and readied for the next cycle. In some sections, it is left to rest, so the soil can recover nutrients naturally before being used again. And that rotation is what keeps everything alive long-term. What makes this system compelling is how every stage depends on the one before it. If preparation is weak, planting suffers. If planting is poorly managed, growth becomes inconsistent. If irrigation fails, yield drops. And if harvesting is rushed, the next cycle is affected. Everything is connected. Nothing exists alone. Even the tools and equipment inside the farm exist within this cycle. Basic machinery for soil preparation, simple transport systems for moving goods, and storage spaces for seeds and harvested crops all play supporting roles. None of them are central, but all of them are necessary. And in this structure, time becomes the most important resource. Not speed, not visibility. Time. Because unlike industries where results can be accelerated through attention or demand, agriculture does not respond to urgency. It responds to conditions. Temperature, soil quality, rainfall, and timing all matter more than pressure or expectation. That is why the system feels so different from fast-moving worlds like entertainment. In the life connected to Katrina Halili, success once depended heavily on visibility. Being seen, being recognized, Being active in a public cycle that moves quickly and constantly shifts focus. But this system works in the opposite direction. It does not require attention to function. It requires consistency. And over time, consistency becomes structure. Structure becomes stability, and stability becomes valuable. That is the logic behind it. And once you understand that, the farm stops being just land. It becomes a system designed to repeat itself successfully over and over again, as long as it is maintained properly. And that brings the story to its next layer. Because once a system like this is running smoothly, the next question is no longer how it works, but what it is worth. Number 4, the value behind it all. At this stage of the story, the focus shifts away from how the system works and moves toward a more uncomfortable question. What is all of this actually worth? Because in this version of events connected to Katrina Halili in the Philippines, the farm is no longer just a physical space or a working system. It becomes an asset, and assets always raise questions about value. But unlike something with a fixed price tag, farmland doesn't work like that. Its value is not static. It is built, layer by layer, over time. And that's what makes it difficult to define in simple terms. Because at the surface level, land value in the Philippines depends on location, size, accessibility, and agricultural potential. But in reality, those are just starting points. What truly shapes long-term value is productivity, how effectively the land is used across seasons. A poorly managed farm can lose value even if the land itself is large. A well-managed one can increase in worth over time, even without expanding its physical size. That's the difference. And in this case, the farm isn't treated as a single purchase or moment of investment. It is treated as an evolving system, one that gains value through continuous cycles of production. Each cycle adds something. Better soil management improves yield. Improved irrigation increases consistency. Efficient harvesting reduces waste. And over time, these small improvements accumulate into something much larger than the starting point. That is how agricultural value compounds. Slowly, quietly, but steadily. And that slow accumulation is what separates farmland from fast-moving financial systems. It doesn't spike overnight. It builds across years, sometimes even decades. And that is why it is often seen as a long-term stability asset rather than a short-term gain. And now, what is associated with Katrina Halili becomes less about immediate perception and more about long-term positioning. Because the logic behind owning or operating land is not about visibility, it is about control over time. Time determines planting cycles. Time determines harvest quality. Time determines sustainability. And whoever controls the system must learn to work with time rather than against it. That is where the deeper value lies. Not in what the land produces in a single season, but in what it consistently produces over many seasons. And that consistency is what builds financial stability. Because agriculture, unlike many modern industries, is tied to real-world demand that never disappears. People always need food. Supply chains always need raw materials. Markets always depend on production. That constant demand gives farmland a different kind of resilience. It doesn't follow trends. It follows necessity. And necessity does not fade easily. But even beyond production, there is another layer of value that comes from infrastructure. Because once a farm is properly developed, irrigation systems in place, storage areas built, cycles stabilized, it becomes more than just land. It becomes a functioning operational system. And systems are harder to replace than assets. That is why agricultural setups can become increasingly valuable over time without changing size. Efficiency itself becomes an asset. Structure becomes value. Stability becomes worth it. And that's where the interpretation deepens again. Because in entertainment-driven industries like the one Katrina Halili is associated with, value is often external. It depends on audience engagement, relevance, and visibility. But in agriculture, value is internal. It depends on what the system can consistently produce without external attention. That difference changes everything. One is driven by perception, the other is driven by output, and over time, output becomes more stable than perception. Because perception can change quickly. But production requires continuity, and continuity builds resilience. So the farm becomes more than just a rural setting. It becomes a long-term structure where value is not extracted once, but generated repeatedly through cycles that reinforce themselves. And that leads to a deeper realization. Because once something is built around repetition and sustainability, its worth is no longer defined by a single number. It is defined by its ability to keep functioning, to keep producing, to keep existing without breaking its cycle. And that is where the real idea of wealth begins to shift, away from what is seen and toward what continues. And that brings the story to its final layer. Because beyond structure, beyond cycles, and beyond value, there is still the question of what this entire shift actually represents. And that is where everything comes together. Number 5, bigger than farming. By now, the story is no longer just about land, crops, or even lifestyle changes. It has evolved into something more reflective, something that says a lot about how success is being redefined today. Because when people look at Katrina Halili, they don't just see a public figure from the entertainment world in the Philippines anymore. They start to see something else forming underneath that image, a quieter direction, a different kind of ambition, and a shift in what it means to build a meaningful life outside the spotlight. And whether every detail is publicly known or not, the idea itself is what resonates. Because this isn't just about farming, it's about a mindset shift that's happening far beyond one person. In a world where attention has become a form of currency, most success stories are built around visibility, followers, screens, constant presence. But there's another version of success quietly growing in the background. One that doesn't rely on being seen every day. One that focuses instead on ownership, stability, and long-term control. And that's where land changes everything. Land doesn't trend. It doesn't go viral. It doesn't depend on algorithms. It simply exists, and when used properly, it continues to produce value over time. That alone makes it fundamentally different from most modern forms of success. So when someone steps into that space, even on a modest scale, it naturally stands out. Not because it's loud, but because it's the opposite of loud. It represents patience in a fast world, stability in an unpredictable one, and structure in a space that is usually defined by constant change. And that contrast is what makes this entire shift interesting, not just as a personal story, but as a reflection of a broader movement. More and more people are starting to question what they're really working toward. Is it visibility or is it control? Is it short-term recognition or long-term security? These are no longer abstract ideas. They're becoming practical decisions people are actively making with their lives and investments. And agriculture, in many ways, sits right at the center of that conversation. Because it connects directly to something everyone depends on: food, resources, sustainability. It's not optional, it's essential. And anything essential tends to hold value even when everything else changes around it. That's why even the idea of a farm connected to a public figure carries weight beyond its physical presence. It becomes symbolic. It represents a different direction, one that prioritizes grounding over glamour and long-term thinking over instant visibility. And that's what makes this shift feel bigger than just one person's decision. It reflects a larger truth. Success is no longer one-dimensional. It doesn't have a single shape anymore. For some, it will still be fame and entertainment. For others, it will be ownership, independence, and building something that exists quietly but steadily over time. And sometimes it can be both worlds intersecting in unexpected ways. That's why this story lingers. Because it doesn't rely on spectacle, it relies on contrast. On the difference between what people expect and what actually exists beneath the surface. And once you understand that, the entire picture becomes clearer. Not just what the farm looks like, not just what it represents. But why does it matter in the first place? Because in the end, this isn't really a story about farming at all. It's a story about how people are starting to redefine what it means to build a life that lasts. And that's a shift you can't ignore, not anymore. And that's the story, where attention fades, but systems keep working in silence. Because real value isn't always loud, it's what keeps growing long after the spotlight moves on. If you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Her Status for more deep dive stories like this.